Let's continue our study of the 7 principles of the Constitution with Lesson 16, which is part 2 of this unit. And as in the last one, our single TEKs are 15D, that we can analyze how the 7 principles of the Constitution are reflected in the U.S. government. Let's backtrack here for just a second. And one of the last ones we looked at was limited government, the idea that government follows the law and that the powers of government leaders are limited by the Constitution. So what we're going to look at today with Lesson 16 is some of the principles that help achieve that idea of limited government. And the first of these is separation of powers. So here we see our examples of the judicial with Judge Judy, the executive with President Obama, and then here's our friend Bill for the legislative branch. So how is power divided in the government? The Constitution created 3 branches of government, which was an improvement over the Articles of Confederation, which really only had the one branch in Congress. And each of these branches has separate powers, and yet they also work together with each other. So how is power divided? Let's begin with Article 1, which created the legislative branch, which is Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, as we studied with the Great Compromise. So here we have the symbol for Congress. And the function of the legislative branch is to make the laws. These are the lawmakers, the ones who write and pass bills. And their job is to serve the law, create the law, and to serve the constituents, which are the voters. The House of Representatives is elected every 2 years so that it will be closest to the people and that the representatives will be most responsible to their constituents. Then we have Article 2, which created the executive branch, which is headed by the president. And the function of the executive branch is to enforce the laws. And this is done through the alphabet soup agencies such as the IRS, which collects taxes, the FBI, which is law enforcement, DEA, FCC, and any number of branches. And also the Department of Defense comes under the president and the cabinet. And their job is to serve the needs of the country. And then finally we have Article 3, which created the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, and the lower courts underneath that. The function of this branch is to interpret the laws, and they decide if laws are constitutional, a principle which, or a power which is called judicial review, and we'll discuss that in quite a bit more detail when we get to Unit 5. And the job of the judicial branch is to serve the Constitution, to see that the Constitution is upheld in our laws in our daily life. And let's continue on to our next principle, which is related to separation of powers, but is a little bit different. And this is the checks and balances system. So we talked about how power was divided, but now how power evenly distributed. If we want to think of the 3 branches here, we want to think of them as forming an equilateral triangle, with the angles and sides all equal, and that the powers are divided evenly between them. So the principle of checks and balances allows each branch of government to check, which means control the other branches, and it helps them to work together fairly. The example I like to use is a sort of a very complicated game of rock, paper, scissors, in which all 3 players, or all 3 pieces of that game, are equal and each one has powers above and below the others. So here's an example of checks and balances. The president, which represents the executive branch, can nominate Supreme Court justices, which gives him a check, or the president, over the judicial branch. But the Senate, again legislative branch, has to confirm the nomination. So here we see all 3 branches interplaying, where the president has a check on the judicial, but the legislative has a check on the executive as well. So let's now turn to our next principle, and that is federalism. We are all aware of the United States government, which covers all 50 states, and is also referred to as the federal government. And the reason for that is that alongside this national or federal government are the 50 state governments, and they share power with this national government. So let's see what's meant by federalism. How is power shared? The federal system created a national government, and within that, state governments, which in turn create local governments, such as cities, towns, counties, and school districts, and governments of that sort. And each of these levels of government has different responsibilities, but they work together with the others. So one example of this might be, say, law enforcement. Let's say that a crime occurs in a local town or jurisdiction. The first responders are going to be the local police, the city police, or the county sheriffs. But they, in turn, might ask for help from the state, such as the DPS or the state troopers. Should it go on beyond that jurisdiction, the state may ask for help from the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So all three of these levels would work together in order to solve the crime. So that's just one example of how federalism might work. And then, of course, we have individual rights. And these are guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. And the government works to protect the rights of its citizens. If you recall, the Anti-Federalists were very concerned about the lack of a Bill of Rights and whether individual rights and freedoms would be protected by this new government. So they were promised that the Bill of Rights would be added, and sure enough it was. And these first 10 amendments to the Constitution list the citizens' rights. For example, here we see freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and the right to a jury trial. So these are just some of our rights under the Bill of Rights, and we'll go into more detail on these in lessons 18 and 19. So our lesson 16 thoughts. How did establishing three branches of government with separate powers improve upon the Articles of Confederation system? Why do you think the framers created a federal system instead of just a national government? And finally, which principle discussed in Part 1 is also a part of all the principles discussed in Part 2? And I think I gave that away a little bit at the beginning. All right, well, that concludes our study of the principles of the Constitution, and our next lesson is Lesson 17 on the Living Constitution.